George and Ruth had been married for over a decade. They had met in their early 20s, and from the moment they started dating, they had been inseparable. They had worked multiple jobs, saved every penny, and invested in their future together. Along the line, Ruth got pregnant and gave birth to a bouncing baby girl who they named Carla. George and his wife, Ruth, were both very happy for the birth of their daughter, Carla, and they labored all they could to give her a better life. After the birth of their daughter, the couple's hard work paid off. They began to reap the rewards. George met an old friend who helped him establish a good business which began to flourish. George and his wife began to save little money from their profit, and before you knew it, the business became a very successful business known by many. After a few years of hard working, they were able to build a beautiful house for themselves, expanded their business, and were living the life they had always dreamed of. But as George's wealth grew, so did his stingy nature grew. At first, Ruth thought that it was due to not having enough income, but as time progresses, she began to discover that George was naturally stingy and doesn't want to do anything about it. Ruth had called him and talked to him on several occasions, but there was still no changes. George became obsessed with saving money, and would deny himself and Ruth even the smallest of pleasures. He would monitor Ruth's cooking to know the quantity of ingredients she was using to cook. After the cooking, he would also reduce the portions of food dished out by Ruth. It became a great concern Ruth, as she was also made to wear her clothes and shoes until they were old and worn out. Ruth would often complain about the worn-out furniture in their living room, but George would refuse to replace it, saying it was still functional. He would buy her cheap, second-hand clothes, and get angry when she would complain about the quality. When Ruth got pregnant for their second baby, George refused to take her to the hospital for regular checkups, saying it was too expensive. He would instead try to diagnose her symptoms himself, using the internet as his guide. Due to that, she lost the pregnancy. Ruth was bitter, but after crying for days, she still decided to stay with George. Ruth's friends and family would often invite them to dinner parties and social gatherings, but George would always decline, saying they couldn't afford it. He would instead insist on cooking at home, using the cheapest ingredients he could find. As the years went by, Ruth began to feel like she was living with a stranger. She felt unappreciated, unloved, and unseen. She would try to talk to George about her feelings, but he would just dismiss her, saying she was being too materialistic. The final straw came when their daughter, Carla, fell ill and needed urgent medical attention. George refused to take her to the hospital, saying it was too expensive. He instead tried to treat her himself, using herbal remedies and homeopathic treatments. When those things didn't work out, he gave his wife little money to get Carla some medication from the roadside stall. Though Ruth didn't like the idea, but she had no choice. After Carla took the medication, she still didn't get better, and as days passed by, Carla's condition worsened. Ruth knew that she had to do anything possible to keep her child alive. She had to take her to the hospital, but the doctor insisted she must pay before any treatments can be carried out on her. Ruth went in search of as she was, and as she was still at it, the hospital called her that her child was dead. When George heard this, he blamed Ruth for everything, saying that if she hadn't taken her to the hospital, she wouldn't have died. Ruth was devastated. She had lost her child, and she had lost the man she once loved. She realized that she couldn't stay in the marriage any longer. And so she packed her bags and left. George was relieved. He saw Ruth as a materialistic wife who had only been interested in his money. He was happy to be rid of her, and weeks after mourning his daughter, he quickly set about finding a new wife. That was when he met Grace. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed to share George's values. She looked frugal and responsible with money, and George was immediately smitten. They got married in a small ceremony, and at first, everything seemed perfect. Neoma was the perfect wife, or so it seemed. George was happy that Grace was the type that manages both money and other things well. Whenever George says that they will cook without meat, she would gladly do it without complaining. To James, Grace was the ideal woman, and because of this, George left her in charge of most of his finances. But there was something that George was not aware of. He was not aware that behind closed doors, Grace was stealing from him. She would take small amounts of money at first, but as time went on, she became bolder and bolder. She would forge George's signature, withdraw from his bank accounts, and even sell some of his assets. George was oblivious to it all. He was too busy enjoying his new life with Grace to notice what was going on. But one day, it all came crashing down. George received a call from his bank, informing him that his accounts had been emptied and if he was aware of that. At first, he thought it was a joke, but when the bank kept calling, he had to immediately rush to the bank, only to discover that Grace had stolen everything he had labored so hard for. He searched for Grace everywhere, but she was nowhere to be found. Grace was gone, and gone with anything he could call his. George was devastated. He had lost all of his money, and he had lost his second wife. He realized too late that he had been blind to Grace's true nature, and that he had paid the price for his own stupidity. As he sat amidst the ruins of his life, George couldn't help but think of Ruth. He realized that he had taken her for granted, and that he had lost a true partner and friend. He made several attempts to get her back, but was too late now. Ruth was already a successful businesswoman, and she was doing well for herself. Ruth was gone, and George was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life.